I'm going to say something real controversial here. Quantum mechanics is hard. It's something that I've been wanting to look into for a while, but I struggle with motivation. So I figured I'd give myself a little boost and connect it back to anime, because I'm a fucking weeb. So what I'm going to do is go through Bunny Girl Senpai and talk about the science that is brought up. I'm going to compare the actual science in real life versus the science that is brought up in the show. I'm not going to be getting into the main story of Bunny Girl Senpai, so if you haven't seen it, then you might end up being a little bit confused, but there's not going to be any spoilers or anything. And let me go ahead and give this warning. The last time that I had any kind of science class was back in college, over a decade ago, and it was Introduction to Calculus-Based Physics, and I was just happy to pass. So trust me when I say I am not an expert in this whatsoever. I'm going to do my best to represent what the actual science is, but it's going to be dumbed down to my level, which means it's probably not going to be 100% accurate. So if an actual scientist tells you something that I'm completely wrong on this, trust them, not me. All right, with that out of the way, let's get into some science. In the first couple of episodes, they basically center the ideas around Schrodinger's cat. And that is a very famous thought experiment. But before we can get into that, we're going to have to get down into the weeds a little bit and talk about superpositions. So I'm just going to go ahead and steal a definition here. Superposition is the ability of a quantum system to be in multiple states at the same time until it is measured. Simple enough, right? Now, I've seen lots of examples that try to explain all of this, but I have my own idea that I think will work out better. And being both extremely biased and ignorant, I think this is a better example. All right, let's say you have a track. Don't worry about the actual distance. I'm not about to do any math in this video. An absolutely insane person who thinks that exercising is fun decides to go run some laps. So we'll make A the starting point and B the midway point around the track. And so they run for a certain amount of time. Again, I'm not about to do math. It really doesn't matter. We can add in a caveat that they at least make one lap around, but other than that, they run for an X amount of time. They record everything start to finish and now have a video of the entire run. So now that we have this file, let me ask a question. Is the runner closer to A or B? A, B, both, neither? At some points they were closer to A, some points they were closer to B. To put it bluntly, it's just a stupid fucking question. The runner is in a superposition. They have been at every single spot around this track. Until you actually take a measurement, you can't know whether the runner is closer to A or B. In this case, taking a measurement would be considered stopping and looking at a specific time. But once you do that, then you have a more definite answer. So with that idea in mind, let's look at Schrodinger's cat. So Schrodinger saw this whole superposition stuff and decided to make a little thought experiment. So he said, what if you took a cat and put it in a box? And also you put some kind of device that would kill the cat. But it had a 50-50 chance of going off over the course of, we'll say an hour. So at the end of that hour, right before you looked inside the box, there was a 50-50 chance of that cat being alive or dead. So according to the idea of superpositions, then the cat is both alive and dead until you measure it. Now, if you listened to that and you thought, man, that sounds fucking stupid, well, you're in luck, because that was the point. Schrodinger wasn't a huge fan of the whole superposition idea, or at the very least not of some of the implications that came along with it. So he came up with his example to kind of show how ridiculous the whole thing is. He said even if you haven't observed the cat, it is either alive or dead. It can't be both. And yet superpositions are still relevant. At the time, Schrodinger's big hate of the idea was that a conscious observer was needed. Basically, the cat was in a superposition of being alive and dead until a conscious observer went and made a measurement. But since then, we've discovered that a conscious observer isn't needed. In the thought of the Schrodinger's cat, the device that is actually possibly killing the cat is doing the measurement. So he is right that before someone goes and looks to check to see if the cat is alive or dead, the measurement has already been made. So the cat is either alive or dead. It is not both, but it's not because an observer had anything to do with it. It was because there was something else doing the measurement. All right, let's talk about the famous double slit experiment. So I think the original used light, and basically what happened is they had light go through a barrier that had two slits in it, and then had a sensor on the other side. So as the light went through the barrier, it functioned kind of like a wave, where two waves end up forming through the slits, and they interfered with each other and gave us this result on the sensor at the end. There's different variations with this experiment, but the one that I'm going to talk about a little more is with single particles. So I think it's been done with electrons and protons, and maybe even some other stuff. I don't even know. So pick whatever you want. I'm going to be using electrons for this example. So if we do about the same setup and only use one electron at a time, for the first experiment, we'll block one side of the barrier. So there's only one slit. And what we see is that of the few electrons that actually make it through, they end up hitting the sensor at the back one at a time. So we know it's only one is being sent, only one is being picked up whenever they actually go through this slit. And the pattern that starts to appear looks like this, which makes sense. That's about what we would expect with only one slit. But if we remove that barrier and we let both slits be open, then we do the exact same experiment. We send one at a time through, and every time only one electron hits the sensor. And eventually we get a pattern that looks like this. And that's not the kind of pattern that we would expect to see, only sending one electron at a time. It looks like something is interfering. So what we can do is we can set up another sensor on the left side of the barrier here for the left slit. And what this will do is that anytime an electron goes through the left side, it will beep so that we know that it's going through the side. We'll run the experiment again, and what we find is that as the electrons are hitting the sensor in the back, the sensor by the barrier beeps roughly half the time. So half the time it seems to be going through the left side, half the time it seems to be going through the right side. But the pattern that appears looks a little different. It looks like this. So when we didn't have the sensor by the barrier, was the electron going through the left side, the right side, both? The answer is yes. What seems to happen is that the electron, even by itself, is in a superposition so that when it goes through the slit, it goes through both the left and the right, much in the same way that a wave would. And then it interferes with itself, which causes the weird pattern that we see. But if you measure it, then basically that superposition collapses into one side. So it is either the left or the right once it is measured. And there are multiple different theories on why this happens exactly, but I don't have enough of an understanding to try to portray it, and I am a terrible teacher. So if you are wanting to know more details on this, you're just gonna have to go look it up yourself. All right, let's bring in some anime to this. In the show, a certain someone is said to be in a superposition of existing and not existing. Basically, the people around her are taking the measurements of her either existing or not existing. And as more and more people observe that she doesn't exist, then that starts to affect others, and she begins to not exist for everybody. As you can tell, the interpretation from the show suffers from the same problem that Schrodinger railed against, that a conscious observer is needed. There was also the idea that the measurement was different for each person. So some people saw her as existing and some people didn't. That would be like the Schrodinger's cat having some people, like after they measure it, some people would see the cat as alive and some people would see it as dead. Like that didn't make any sense to me whatsoever. But it's an anime. It's not going to be super accurate. I get it. But really, like overall, it's not too bad. The biggest problem is probably that they're using like a dated view of what superpositions are. But again, for an anime, that's I'm really not all that bad. But that's all I want to talk about for this. We'll get into more fun quantum mechanics in future videos. See ya. All right, I'm gonna put this little rant here at the end. One thing that I've learned from all of this is that we have to study these effects at the quantum level because by the time we get to our level, what we see on a day-to-day basis, all of the superposition stuff basically has been collapsed into one position. That's because there's so much interference and so many different things that do measurements basically that we just don't see those same effects as what you would see on a quantum level. And I have heard people talk about quantum mechanics before and basically try to take some of the effects that happens at a quantum level and like scale it up to more of what we see and say those same effects aren't drowned out basically. And I knew it bugged me. There was something about it that bugged me every time I heard all this quantum woo bullshit. And I couldn't put my finger on it. So now I can.